spent his childhood in Brooklyn, a part of the Seagate neighborhood, which has a population that is 80% Orthodox Jews of Russian origin. Okay, so they're coming in, they're settling in Brooklyn. That's going to be relevant for later in this episode, so I won't remember that. And similarly, we heard about this when we discussed Robert Maxwell yesterday. His parents were Seymour Epstein, who was a city parks department employee, and Pauline Epstein, who was a school aide. We're told that he was the product of middle-class New York City. That's the same story we're told all the time. All of these refugees didn't have much, then they're just all going to become very wealthy in a very short amount of time. Millions and sometimes billions. We know that he attended local public schools before he entered Lafayette High School, which is in South Central Brooklyn. That is, in fact, a photo of Jeffrey Epstein that we have here on the screen. Somebody had included this and said Epstein signed my dad's high school yearbook and wrote "Be cool" in his yearbook. So that is Jeffrey Epstein. And then we are told that he reportedly graduated several years early. Okay? I don't know how early, was he a freshman, just took him out? But we do know that he next appears in 1969. Jeffrey Epstein enters the prestigious Cooper Union College, but then suddenly and inexplicably, he drops out. Just drops out. Then he enrolls again in 1971 in the Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences at NYU. He's there in 1971 to study the mathematical aspects of cardiac physiology. That's very specific. But guess what? He doesn't make it to the end because he drops out. He drops out of the Courant Institute. Again, we're not giving him why it's inexplicable. What we do know is that in 1973, Donald Barr, who we discussed, he was then the head of the prestigious Dalton School, publishes this mysterious book, Space Relations. We talked about this. And this book is foretelling about a sexual blackmail ring, children that are going to be molested, all to serve this demonic space colony known as KOSSAR, K-O-S-S-A-R, guys, not to be confused with Khazars, okay? They're involved in sex trafficking, and for whatever reason, it's a really disgusting book that the head of a school decided to publish in 1974, not creepy at all, and it foretells the story of Ghislaine and Jeffrey Epstein. Now, what I didn't tell you before is that it should be mentioned that Donald Barr was a member at that time of the Office of Strategic Services in America. That the OSS was what became the CIA. It was the predecessor of the CIA. Okay? You've got this guy who is an agent for the government publishing this book foretelling of a sex trafficking ring, a powerful colony that believes that it sits above everybody else, and yeah, then what happens? I'm also going to note for you that Donald Barr, because we've got one element of this, is like changing identities. And one way you can change your identity is to just be baptized into a church. That's something that my research has made me understand. A lot of baptism name changes. Donald Barr also was raised with Jewish parents, and then he decided to convert to Catholicism. So he converted to Catholicism, but he is, ethnically, he is Jewish. And so would therefore his son, William Barr, be as well. Of course, it's relevant to the story as we are warming up on learning about the Mossad and Israel.
Hello, you're through to Merriweather Security Consulting. What can I do for you? Thank you. A helicopter is on its way.
Institute. Inexplicably, Epstein's then hired at that Dalton school, where our government guy got weird fantasies and books that he's publishing. Is heading up the school. And why is Epstein hired? Well, he's hired to teach mathematics and physics, despite not having a degree in either. Prestigious school, $50,000 a year. By 1976, Epstein is dismissed for teaching at the Dalton School. Parents were complaining about the weakness of his teaching. It also was alleged by students that went there, and NPR has a long article, that he was often in the company of young girls and taught outside of the school. And this is a blurb from a New York Times piece. 8 former students who attended the prestigious school during Mr. Epstein's short tenure there said that his conduct with teenage girls had left an impression that had lingered for decades. One former student recalled him showing up at a party where students were drinking, while most remembered his persistent attention on the girls in hallways and classrooms. She said, I can remember thinking at the time that this is wrong. That is a quote from Scott Spicer, who graduated from Dalton in 1976. Well, no matter, because, then he left. In 1978, the legend goes, kind of hand of Midas, touch of Midas in all of this. Legend goes that through a connection at the school, he was tutoring someone's kid, and then he somehow gets into the situation where he meets the CEO of Bear Stearns. That CEO is Alan Greenberg, who then decides to make him a junior assistant on the trade floor. He obviously knows nothing about finance. I don't know if there's anything about math or science either. Both in just 4 years, he rises through the ranks and becomes partner. He is a limited partner at Bear Stearns. What? Don't worry, guys. By 1981, he departs Bear Stearns, and I'll tell you why. Some employees, by the way, say that he was fired, but Jeffrey Epstein has always maintained that he resigned out of his own free will after a relatively minor violation with the SEC that resulted in a relatively minor fine of $2,500. That's his story, and he's sticking to it, or he was sticking to it, or he is sticking to it, who knows if he's alive. But curiously enough, his departure coincided with the opening, the very day that Jeffrey Epstein left. The SEC was actually opening a procedure to look into insider trading that they alleged had occurred in the context of a corporate takeover bid that was being led by Edgar Bronfman Sr., who was the head of Seagram's. Now, that name's sounding familiar to you. Edgar Bronfman Sr., because yesterday I told you not to forget this name. I told you to remember the name Edgar Bronfman Sr. because he was the guy that was working at this time with Robert Maxwell. Because he was also heading up the World Jewish Conference, and he was working with Robert Maxwell on the refused crisis. Essentially, we want Russian Jews to come settle into Israel. The Russian government says, no, you can't do that. Why would we just grant visas for all everybody to travel to Israel? I want to be clear, in this very year, 1981, that is when Edgar Bronfman becomes the president of the World Jewish Conference and focuses on that project to lobby Russia to grant visas to Russian Jews to depart to Israel. And you have to ask yourself, now we know at that same time he's working with Jeffrey Epstein, and the SEC's looking in going, wait, I think some insider trading just happened here. You have to wonder what suddenly then convinces the Russians to allow that to take place. Or what convinced, by the way, the Russian Jews, for that matter, to want to abandon their homeland to move to the Middle East. Was there an incentive provided? Was there a financial incentive provided? I'm just asking questions. Was Robert Maxwell the only Israel firster hotshot that was committing financial crimes to help Israel? Because remember, he's robbing pensions. What's going on over here with these banks that are getting into trouble? I will note now that per 2003 Vanity Fair article, the SEC never officially brought the proceedings against Bear Stearns for insider trading, but its questions seem to indicate that it was remarkably skeptical. SEC body was remarkably skeptical of Epstein's answers. Vanity Fair writes that some sources wondered why, if he had such an important role at Bear Stearns, the partner, why would he have left over just a small fine, $2,500? Something else was clearly going on there. Now, next part of Epstein's biography gets a little bit murky. And I want to tell you, by the way, what he was interested in. That's kind of like, what was his public life profile? He had all of this money. We don't really know how he has it or how he gets it. But he's everywhere. And I'll tell you some things that he was passionate about. He's a passionate guy. He was passionate about issues relating to human consciousness, brain function, and also, particularly, transhumanism. Gosh, this is really becoming a theme. Transhumanism. He had spoken about how he planned to freeze his body to be reanimated in the future when science allowed it, and he envisioned the insemination of dozens of women with his sperm in order to, quote, strengthen the genetic heritage of the Earth. Now, I'm just going to park right here and just say that that sounded like I could have been reading ideas from Elon Musk. That just, that is something that he talks about a lot. Human consciousness, and I have always said and maintained that there's something weird about Elon Musk's background. It gives me the Midas touch. It just doesn't when I watch him speak. I just don't buy it. But parking aside, these were Epstein's ideas, not Elon Musk. They just would have been kind of the same. And yet, so he wanted to do this just to strengthen the genetic heritage of Earth, to inseminate dozens of women with his sperm. And he supported, therefore, Germinal Choice, which is a sperm bank of noble laureates. Okay? Jeffrey Epstein also, in this capacity, gave, of course, tens of millions of dollars in donations to Harvard. I say, of course, because as we have learned, Harvard is running some sort of facade operation. I feel very confident to state that it's very clear they're going through Harvard, seriously getting in not very bright people and suddenly put in positions of power. So I think that is a fair thing to surmise. It's my opinion. Be careful, because Harvard's coming down on speech at the moment. Now, he then made, Jeffrey Epstein, some curious donations, given the fact that he does not have any children. He donated $25,000 to a children's tennis club in Maryland. He donated $30,000 to a preschool in New York. He donated $15,000 to a private girls' school that is a stone's throw away from his New York mansion. In 2017, he made another $50,000 donation, this time to the UJA, which is the Federation of Jewish Philanthropies of New York, and they are openly committed to world governance. They are openly committed to establishing this one world government. Epstein also gave to a ton of politicians. I'll give you some of them right here. Interesting names on this list. You can look through this, but President George H.W. Bush definitely stands out. Former Secretary of State John Kerry stands out. I know the Clintons are on the list as well. John Kasich is on this list. Senator Chuck Schumer is on this list. It is quite telling. He primarily gave to Democrats, but it is quite telling which Republicans he decided to give to. For Senator Bob Dole. It's definitely something that I think deserves, somebody should definitely prod that narrative and see what motivated him to give to these people, especially in states he didn't live in. Now, jumping back into our timeline, 1981, which is this big year, right? You've got him with Edgar Bronfman. Edward Bronfman is working factually with Robert Maxwell, and that was also the year 1981 that began the Iran-Contra affair that we discussed yesterday. The Iran-Contra affair is what connects Epstein to Robert Maxwell. Not just the Edgar Bronfman, but also through the Refusenik scandal, but also, as Ari Ben-Menashe told us, the insistence at that time was coming from Robert Maxwell in his office in London